Socrates was a sophist. He was executed for being a sophist. And yet, if you read Plato, it looks like Socrates was the sworn mortal enemy of the sophists. This is the story you often hear taught by professors, academics. You find it in books, podcasts, on YouTube, and it's not wrong. Well, it's not entirely wrong. The classic dialogue for Socrates' confrontation with sophism and the sophists is the dialogue, the Protagoras. Protagoras was a real historical person who was quite remarkable and extraordinarily talented. But in order to understand the importance of this very beautiful dialogue, which is the reading for this week in the Plato Project, the Plato Project is my project to bring Plato's works, all of them, to everyone. We're reading through all of them in a year. It's only 50 pages a week or less. And this is the dialogue we're on now. I'll also be touching on the dialogues from last week, the Menexenus and the Theages. But in order to understand the significance of the Protagoras, we need to think about what the significance of sophistry is. Think about the fact that Plato, 2,300 and plus years ago, is still the king, you could say, of our language. Many of the key terms we use, for example, as insults, come from Plato, specifically this dialogue, the Protagoras, in the sense that we'll say of a politician, oh, well, he's a sophist. What do we mean? We mean someone who uses language and skill in language to deceive, to advance their power. Fundamentally, sophism has come to mean the use of skill in language, particularly to exercise power in politics, irrespective of the truth. So a sophist is someone who portrays themselves as an expert in the general skill of guiding human beings into a better life, whether in the political community or individual students. And the primary way that the sophist does this is through language. And thus Socrates, in many of his dialogues, is concerned to try to understand what exactly is it that people are teaching when they teach a skill. In the Protagoras, we see the classic Socratic technique of starting with very clear things. If you want to learn how to play the flute and you go to a flute teacher, what do you expect to learn? Well, flute playing. If you want to learn to be a good rider and you go to a riding master, what do you expect to learn? Well, how to be an excellent equestrian. If you go to a sophist, he asks the young gentleman who he's taking to see Protagoras, what is it you expect to learn? Now, this is a very deep question. When you go to school, when you get an education, what is it you're expecting to have? Consider the fact that many people will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of their lifetime, whether as parents, students, teachers, or both, to acquire what we call an education. And if you ask those people, maybe ask yourself, what is it that you think you were asking for or receiving when you say you wanted or received an education? My bet is most of us can't answer the question. Should we feel bad about this? I don't think we should feel bad, but we might want to be a little worried about what it says, because it suggests that we're still standing with Socrates asking Protagoras these questions. Protagoras was someone who claimed that he was worth an enormous amount of money. He was kind of a very expensive private educator for the wealthy men of the aristocratic world of the Greek city-states. And he would go around telling people that you should take your son and put him with me, take him away from most of his other associations, and let him associate with me every day, and he will become better. Protagoras literally says, if you study with me, you will leave by the end of the day better than you were in the morning, and so it will be every day as long as you study with me. Isn't that an amazing thing? Wouldn't it be worth any money that you could afford to pay to study with someone who, by just being with them by the end of the day, you would be better? That's exactly what the Theages is about. Although some scholars dispute whether Socrates wrote, or whether the Socrates depicted in the Theages is really a Platonic depiction written by Plato, or whether it's written by one of his students, the important point is that Theages concerns this very deep issue. How do you learn? Through association. The Greeks had a very traditional idea that essentially being around a person somehow imparted some kind of energy or wisdom. But experts know exactly what they're imparting. Experts know they're imparting a particular skill. I've taught the piano, and when I'm teaching the piano, I know what I'm teaching, at least in a very general sense. It's harder if you say, well, what exactly is music? And teaching musicality is harder to explain, but you can still explain it. You can give examples. But what is wisdom? Sophos. What does it mean to be sophos or wise? That, Socrates says, is what we should ask Protagoras. Throughout the dialogues we've been discussing, we see the core issue that comes up over and over again is, can the excellence of being a human, can the unique thing that makes the human being live their best life, that lets us be most fully realized, the arete tu anthropou, or the virtue of the human, the unique excellence of the human, can this be taught? The premise of Sophism is that it can be taught. Because it can be taught, it's valuable. Because it's valuable, it's worth paying for. Because it's worth paying for, it's worth charging a lot for. And so the Sophists represented a kind of cultural revolution. Itinerant experts who went around the Greek city-states and transformed their societies by educating the young men. When Socrates was brought to trial as a 70-year-old man, he was accused essentially of being exactly like Protagoras. He defended himself, saying that he was never like the Sophists. He never took money for teaching students, and he claimed not to have students in the way that the Sophists did. So this is a historically important point. Socrates was not in this way a sophist. That is, he did not charge a fee on the premise that he would give people wisdom and make them better every day. But many people like Protagoras thought that you could do that. I would suggest that today there's no more important question. If you know someone who can make you better, you should pay them as much as you can afford to make you better, because there's no better use of your money than to become a better person. I believe that we can use our money and invest in ourselves in a way that will make us better. But that doesn't mean I believe that Protagoras and the Sophists were correct, although I think they make a great case. If you look at this dialogue, you'll find it's one of the most literally brilliant, funny dialogues Plato has ever written. It's a masterpiece that reminds you of the truth of Nietzsche's claim that Plato invented the novel. It's a really artful dialogue. Protagoras is very sympathetically portrayed, and he's very powerful and persuasive. And this has many deep myths, starting with the myth of Epithemius and Prometheus. And I won't get into these myths right now, although they're very important for a full consideration of the dialogue. Rather, what I want to focus your mind on is this specific question that Socrates is raising, which is there a difference between something that can be taught and something that can be learned? People often treat the dialogues like the Protagoras, which are dialogues that end inconclusively, as if they don't take you anywhere conclusively. I suggest if you read the Protagoras, it's really a cooperative effort between Protagoras and Socrates, just as it's portrayed, that leaves us in a very new place than the place we started. What is that place? It's a place where we might realize something quite important. There may be a class of very important skills, the most important of which is learning how to be human, that cannot be taught directly, but that can be learned. Think about that. Is there anything that can be learned but not taught? I suggest that wisdom is something that can absolutely be learned, and that Socrates believed it could be learned. But I think Socrates also is correct to believe it could not be taught. Now, I want to explain this and relate it to the central paradox of the Protagoras, which is the argument that virtue is knowledge. Now, literally, if you translate these terms, its virtue is science. So, arete is episteme. This is the Greek word that we would translate rightly as science. Episteme becomes in Latin scientia or scientia, where we get the word science in the modern Romance languages and English from this Latin word scientia or scientia. So it's a very technical kind of knowledge. It's certain knowledge. And Socrates argues that the only reason people do anything wrong is because they lack a virtue, which means they lack knowledge. This is a famous Socratic claim. Therefore, evil arises from ignorance. So if you're ever studying the Protagoras, or if you've studied in a philosophy course, you'll know this is one of the key claims you need to know about. The Socratic idea that virtue is knowledge, but it's stronger. Again, virtue is science. It's something that's certain. So if you have it, you will not make mistakes. And if you make mistakes, it's a sign you don't have it. Now, what is the problem with this view? Well, Socrates himself ends the dialogue by saying, well, we've got tangled around. If virtue is knowledge, it seems like Protagoras' claim that it should be teachable would make sense, and yet Socrates doesn't think it does. But if virtue isn't knowledge, as Protagoras seems to think, then Socrates' claim would maybe perhaps make more sense. So what's going on? Well, Protagoras says it's time to turn to other topics. So you'll have to read the dialogue for yourself and see where that really leaves you as a reader. But I want to suggest that what it's teaching us is to do with this initial claim I made. Perhaps virtue is knowledge. In fact, it's the highest kind of science. I've recently completed a book that I'm about to send my publisher in a couple weeks. And I've been working on this book for a long time. And one of the things I realized in writing it was the answer to a question that concerns all of us greatly. Why is it that any form of knowledge we have can be abused? Why is it that any form of knowledge we have can be abused? Socrates' answer to this question, I realized, is the key. So Socrates' discussion in the Protagoras has really had a profound influence on my life, even very recently as a scholar. So let me tell you something that can seem unrelated, but in fact it's connected to everything in Socrates' work that Plato gives us. This is the fact that all forms of expertise are subject to abuse, and therefore, while good in themselves, they're dangerous. Paul in the New Testament says that knowledge inflates us. Knowledge inflates us. Socrates was concerned, as I've discussed in past videos, with the way in which the possession of genuine knowledge often leads people to become ignorant. And he describes ignorance in a very deep way in the Protagoras. So this is another key insight that we get. Ignorance is having a false belief and being wrong about it. So it's not just not knowing something, it's believing something wrongly. So in other words, ignorance is a positive state of mind. It's not just that you don't know something, you think wrongly about something. So that means you are subject to systematic misjudgment. Imagine that you have one piece of ignorance in your life, which is that you are not in the place you think you are. And you're ignorant about that in the Socratic sense. It means you'll think you're somewhere other than where you are. Think about the fact that if that was the only mistake you made, nothing you did in your life could ever be appropriate because you would never be doing the right thing, because you would never be in the right place, because you were wrong about where you were. So that kind of ignorance, which is completely amoral, it's not because you're a bad person, but say you have some sort of problem with your mind, some temporary injury, one hopes, and the injury leads you to always think that you're in a different place than you are. So as a result, you go to reach for a cup because you think it's there, but there's no cup there. Or you start to give a speech, but everyone is going to sleep and you have no audience except for the people who are sleeping around you, right? But you think you're supposed to be delivering an oratorical performance. So if you were only wrong about this one thing, where you happen to be, that ignorance in the Socratic sense would destroy your life. So think about, what if you're wrong about something more obviously consequential, like whether you're a good person or not? Most of us think that we're good people. And if we're pushed, we might say, well, how good do you think you are? Are you perfect? I think most of us would say, no, I'm not perfect. Are you terrible? And I think most of us would say, no, I'm not terrible. Well, how good are you? I'm pretty good. Well, think about this. How good? Good in what way? In what ways aren't we good as people? Now think about this. What does it mean if we're ignorant about something as important as how good we are? Then we're in real trouble. And I want to suggest to you that if we're wrong about something that consequential, and we can see how devastating the consequences of ignorance about where we are just physically would be, Socrates' claim is that philosophy as a practice is so radical, and it has to be a practice. It has to be a way of life, because philosophy exists to help people come to terms with the fact that they are exactly not where they think they are. And that is why philosophy offends people who are not comfortable with being ignorant. Many people profess to like philosophy. I've taught many people. I've known many people. I've taught at Yale. I've taught in Germany. I've taught privately for a very long time. And a lot of people, most people would think, I'm a philosopher in the sense that I want to learn. But there's a simple test for whether you want to learn. It's whether you're willing to admit you're wrong. And there's a simple test to know whether you're willing to admit you're wrong. It's how you respond to being corrected. If you're happy to be corrected, you're a philosopher. If you hate being corrected, you're not a philosopher. You don't love wisdom. I would say as humans, we're not naturally philosophers. But you could say, Samuel, isn't the whole Becoming Human project the idea that everyone is a philosopher? Yes, that is. So am I in a contradiction? No. There's a difference between a state of being realized and a state of being potential, and a state of being not being potential. So, for example, say that, God forbid, someone could not use their hands. So they could not learn to play the piano. It's not possible anymore. But, so there's no possibility they can learn the piano. They don't have the potential to learn the piano. So there's no potential ability to become a pianist. But then, by a great medical miracle, their hands are healed, happily, and then they can learn the piano. Now, are they a pianist? No, they're not actually a pianist. Are they potentially a pianist? Yes, they are potentially a pianist. It matters a great deal whether you have the potential to become something, because your potential is somehow part of you. This is a very deep issue. Potentially, you can be many things. What you actually are has to do with what you choose to become. My work is based on the fact that what human existence is, I claim, a philosophical project. You do not simply exist as a human being. You are potentially a human being. But in order to become human, you have to choose to become human. Because being human means being free. And being free means accepting that you're free and using your freedom to make yourself more free. If a person tells themselves that they can't change anything about their life, then they have used their freedom to limit themselves to their current circumstances. That's their choice. But we can choose something very different. We can recognize we don't have to make that choice. We can do different things than what we have done in the past. We can change our lives by making different choices. So in order to make different choices, we need to recognize we have the potential to become different than what we are. But what we are then is either something that's bringing us closer to our nature or taking us farther away. Socrates' argument is that insofar as we're ignorant in the specific Socratic sense of believing falsely, having false ideas about our knowledge, thinking we know things that we don't know, we're not able to fully realize our humanity. I agree. I do not believe that I'm fully what I could be. I think it's therefore incredibly important and valuable for me to invest in my humanity. That investment in my humanity is the everyday practice of becoming human. That's what the Becoming Human project is about. And therefore, I think there's nothing more valuable that I could give to the world than that vision, because I think it's true. I want everyone to be able to recognize they have the inherent dignity of being a person who can become every good thing that they want to be. They can become wise. They can become excellent. And you can do this through practice. None of us are born this way. We all have to practice. So there's a deep equality as I see it. We're all incomplete, and we share an incompleteness that's linked to our ability to always become better. So if we don't have the attitude that human nature is a project, then we'll tend to identify with whatever things we think are best about ourselves, and we'll use them to protect ourselves against ignorance, the ignorance that we actually have. So the fact that we can't teach virtue, according to Socrates, he gives very good arguments for it if you look at the dialogue, very compelling arguments. Many of them have to do with the fact that, as I've discussed in the last video in this series, humans are very poor at conveying the same attributes across time. People whose parents are one way are often not able to teach their children to be the way that they are, even if the way that they are the parents think is good. So Socrates thinks if virtue could be taught, why is this the case? Protagoras, you'll see, gives a very good argument against this, and it leads to a great conversation. You don't have to agree with Socrates, and I'm not saying I do, but I unfortunately am persuaded that virtue in the way that Protagoras and Socrates mean is not something you can teach in the way Protagoras thinks you can, but it can be learned. And the reason it can be learned is the very reason it cannot be taught. I can tell someone the correct thing to do, and if they don't want to do it, it won't matter. So you can say, well, isn't that like any skill? You can teach it, but if a person doesn't want to learn it, they won't. Yes and no. If I teach a piano student, here is how this phrase of Chopin's G minor ballade should sound, and I help them practice it, they have to actually do what I say. But if they don't do what I say at all, they won't even literally be a student, and I wouldn't keep teaching them. Virtue is much more subtle. I can tell a person, hey, here's something that would probably help you, since you wanted to know that, if you're a philosopher. And they can claim to be a philosopher, but then hate me or get angry at me for telling them that. And I can't do anything about that. There's literally nothing you can do about that. And so, in fact, when it comes to virtue, you can't directly teach it the way you can take a person and say, do this with your hands, and then they do it. The will to learn is required to learn anything. But the will to learn has a different role in becoming a human being than it does in any specific expert craft, like playing music or learning wrestling or learning how to garden. The will to learn, I would suggest, is everything. We often do not know exactly how to learn. So the most essential property we have to have is the will to learn. And learning how to be human requires the general desire to become a person who's always learning and improving. And most human beings do not actually have that desire actually. They have it potentially. So every human being is a philosopher potentially because they potentially have the desire to be much more than what they are. But as much as people want to be more than what they are in terms of wealth or money or status, all of which is in itself okay and good, if we get those things without wisdom, without the ability to actually become human, to realize our unique goodness, we'll be unhappy. So wisdom is the only thing that brings with it the ultimate satisfaction in life. And we cannot simply give that to another person the way we can give them other skills. If someone says, I will do what you say, and you're a good teacher, they can learn. I believe Protagoras is partly right when he says people can learn virtue, everyone from everyone, to a limited extent. I think there's a certain sense in which that's true. But why is it that Socrates might be right, that virtue, if it's knowledge, still cannot be taught? Well, because the role of willing to become virtuous is essential. And the willing cannot be taught. You cannot make a person have desire. Ultimately, when we're talking about will, we're talking about the last step of desire. You can will to do something you don't want to do, and you can want to do something and not do it. So there's a difference between desire and will in that sense. But if you really want to do a thing, and you will to do it, you will do it, meaning you will actually manifest it. So you could say, well, you have to have the skill, the right opportunity. Yeah, that's true for things like piano. But if you want to become a better person, and you actually choose every day to become a better person, you absolutely will become a better person. So please do not misunderstand Socrates. I think that what he's trying to teach people is there is no teacher who you can simply surrender yourself to, and without having to practice, except just doing what they say, you can figure out how to be good. A teacher can help you become good. And gurus and sages in all kinds of cultures in India and in other Asian cultures are very important and respected. And in the West, we don't respect teachers probably enough. But in the West, we also have a recognition, which is valuable, that sometimes teachers claim to be able to teach more than they can. And so therefore, in order to recognize what can be taught and what can't be taught, we have to go through the Socratic discipline of asking, can the most unique skill of wisdom, can it be directly taught the way Protagoras thinks? I think it can't be. And the reason is because you can't just bring your kids to a person, drop them off like people do at school, and expect anything transformative to happen. It might, if so, great. But if you want them to become wise, They have to learn how to want to be wise, and there's no way you can directly teach that. And if a person wants to become wise, then even without a direct teacher, they may figure it out. They will pursue teachers, they'll pursue learning, and that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is much more about your inner relationship to the world, which changes your outer relationship to other people because you become genuinely open-minded. So there's a unique set of virtues that are what I would call propedeutic or preparatory virtues that help you become a wise human being. We don't have wisdom yet. I certainly don't, but I would like to have wisdom, so I have to practice. And you can practice certain things like being open-minded, being someone who values criticism, being someone who seeks out criticism so that you can improve yourself. If you're a professional in any area, that's what you do. But most of us are not professionals, you could say, in becoming human, because we can't do the human activity as if it's just another expertise. But we can devote ourselves to philosophy, and that requires our entire self, our entire way of life. That's what Socrates is teaching. So this doesn't solve anything, I think, but I hope it takes you farther down the path of wisdom. I hope it helps you recognize the Protagoras, although it doesn't give a definitive answer to the question of what virtue is and whether it can be taught. It gives us a great deal of insight into the different ideas of virtue, into what ignorance is, into why virtue matters, into why in some senses you could think it could be taught and in others it can't. And ultimately, I think it's asking us to consider this question: if it can't be taught, can't it at least be learned? And is that what Socrates is really trying to teach us? I hope you'll ponder that, and I thank you so much for joining me. I'm Samuel Lonkar, the founder and creator of the Becoming Human Project. You can join the project for $10 a month and get access to that first year subscription to a whole introduction to philosophy, to $500 worth of courses, including my 10-hour introduction to philosophy, science, and religion called Becoming Human Origins, and my 3 intro to philosophy courses, The World, the Soul, and the Gods, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, an introduction to epistemology, and Plato's Symposium, an introduction to aesthetics. So if that interests you, check it out. Please do support the work. And I hope that you today, this weekend, and in the rest of your life, become a philosopher. And I wish you well in that project to become more human every day. Thank you.